Tonight is the first of sort of 5 sessions that we're going to be looking at in Buddhism, what are called the 5 precepts. And I'll go into a little bit of detail shortly about what these principles reflect, what they mean. Tonight we are starting with the first one, which is ahimsa, or non-killing or non-harming. Really, it refers to not killing any living being at all, as a restraint, yeah, as a way of living in the world with dignity and with cause and effect and with the recognition of just how precious this life is. And so in that spirit, I'm going to read you 2 things. Neither are from a Buddhist. Shocking, isn't it? The first one is by Maharaj Charan Singh, who is a great yogi from India. And this is called Life is Precious. We must never forget that our life is like a paper bag that a few drops of water could destroy easily. It is like a piece of thin glass that a little gust of wind could shatter. It is like a goat skin filled with air floating on a river, which would sink to the bottom if the air should leave it. It is like a wall of sand that may collapse at any moment. Therefore, do not merely build castles in the air, but start building them on the ground. Every breath is precious, for once lost it can never return. Make hay while the sun shines. Take advantage of this human body so long as it lasts, in searching for the one without whom the entire world would go adrift and astray. This second one is by another Swami, Swami Shivananda Saraswati, called Conversing with Nature. Smile with the flowers and the green grass. Play with the birds and the deer. Shake hands with the ferns and twigs. Talk to the rainbow, wind, the stars, and the sun. Converse with the running brook and the waves of the sea. Develop friendship with all your neighbors, dogs, especially dogs, cats, trees, and flowers. Then you will have a wide, perfect, and a full life. So, what are these 5 precepts? How do we practice them? The Sanskrit word for the 5 precepts is panchashila. And in Pali, it's known as pankasila. And what this term means, it's a compound term, as many of these terms are in these traditions. Pancha means 5. Yeah, panchaskanda, 5 aggregates. And then shila or sila refers to ethical principles. Yeah, and often these ethical principles are really communicating conduct. So what is it we do? How do we live? Yeah. Now, these are not sort of moral right and wrong kinds of things, but we're encouraged to consider cause and effect without any judgment necessarily. As monastic, and if we consider Buddhism as fundamentally a monastic tradition, it kind of grew out of communities, sanghas, viharas, and Parisha. Parisha is another word for community that also includes the lay following. Um, there are many some ethical principles, or what are called precepts, that are taken. And for monks and for nuns, the Vinaya, or the code of conduct, has many precepts that are to be observed. And sometimes you'll see, if you Google precepts in Buddhism, you'll see 5 precepts, you'll see 8 precepts, you'll see 10 precepts, you'll see 18 precepts. So there are also bodhisattva precepts, which we may get to after we do these. These 5, however, are really kind of the core for Dharma practitioners to live by as lay people. So, for example, whereas the third is not to engage in sexual misconduct, and that'll be week 3. For monastics, it's to abstain from all sexual contact, to basically be celibate and be adhering to the renunciation, the life of renunciation. But for lay people, it's slightly different. Yeah, it's not saying no, you can never have intimacy with a partner and such. But misconduct is very clear, and the Buddha was very clear in terms of what constitutes that. So we'll get into that in a few weeks. But this first one, non-killing or non-harming, kind of reveals, I think, right at the beginning, that there are no black and whites to some of this. Now, yes, monastics are not allowed to take any life, not even for the purpose of food, right? So largely we see in the early Buddhist community, there is a priority of vegetarianism. And yet, if a monastic would go around to the village and collect alms and there were meat there, they wouldn't turn that down, because it was being freely offered, unless it was specifically killed for the monastic. In that case, they are supposed to refuse it. Yeah. So there are these very interesting, nuanced kinds of layers to these precepts, and some of them I think don't have a concrete answer. Yeah. There's a great debate going on sort of in the Buddhist world about defense, right? What if you need to defend yourself? Or things like abortion, which is a very sort of contentious battle going on in our culture, in our society. So we can look at these things, and again, there are no clear-cut answers, but there are different lenses we can look through. So we kind of do arrive at a wholesome understanding of why these precepts matter. Yeah. And for the Buddha, it's not just about behavior. It's not just about living according to certain rules and regulations, but it's that which takes you off the path is to be avoided. And these precepts are there kind of as a mooring line. It's one way to think of it. A mooring line back to the path. That these principles have an impact on our mind and the way that we see ourselves in the world. In essence, our ontology, our way of being. The way that we see ourselves and know ourselves to be in the world. So if we think about it in those terms, the 5th precept is not taking intoxicants. Now, nobody is telling those of us who are lay people, never drink, never have wine, never have beer, never have a shot of whiskey or what have you. Hey, I love a good hot toddy, especially if I don't feel well. And I make good ones, especially since living in New England. And so, there are these kind of nuances to it, but the reason for it is what counts here. Is, for example, not taking intoxicants is really about maintaining a clarity of your mind. So it's not a moral kind of, tisk tisk kind of judgment, but rather it's because we want to maintain a clear mind. We don't want it to become obfuscated and dull and kind of lazy. Yeah. So if we consider these 5 precepts along these lines, this is what is being encouraged in us. And so what are the 5 precepts that we're looking at? So the first one, of course, is non-killing, non-harming. The second one is not stealing or not to take what is not freely given. So for me, that's a very important one in some cases, and yet I also have to advocate for myself in my position at Harvard. Yeah. And so even that, not taking what is not freely offered by others, sometimes that can be nuanced as well. Yeah, because it would be great if I didn't need to have health insurance or pay rent, and I could just float as a renunciant the way that people did 2,400 years ago. So it's important to be stable and advocate in certain ways. Yeah. But it's really, again, it's the spirit that counts here. The third one, as we mentioned a moment ago, not engaging in sexual misconduct. The fourth is not lying. Yeah, not sort of from a more Christian or Abrahamic faith. Let's say, not bearing false witness against other people. That may be another way to say it. And so, speaking truth. Now, of course, this too raises some nuances. There's a chapter that a colleague of mine once wrote in a volume where I also published a chapter where it's called "Knowing When It's Best to Lie," and it's like, well, according to the Buddha, we're supposed to always tell the truth in one way or another. Now, we can speak skillfully, but lying is not something that is seen to be very wholesome. And then the fifth is not taking intoxicants. So there is kind of a reason, there's a cause and effect to each of these 5 precepts. And so how we approach these going forward, for those of you who will be joining us for these sessions on the precepts, there are a couple of questions, and I'll repeat these questions every week. One is to just sort of reflect and sit with how each of these precepts impacts your own mind. Yeah? Before we get embroiled in situations like, yes, but what if this or that? Do these have an impact on the nature of your own consciousness and on your own heart? So it's not just about character building, which is often how it's talked about. The precepts as building character and appreciating and prizing dignity, both ours and those of all living beings. Basically, that in this first precept, that all living beings have a right to live freely and peacefully. Yeah? And really knowing this to be true. It's not just, oh, well, it's a good idea or it's an ideal, but seeing the importance of this truth matters. And then the second one, so the first one is reflecting on how these precepts impact your own mind and your heart. And second, how might these play out in your commitment on a path, whether you call it a spiritual path or a path of mindfulness, to ease suffering? So the precepts are drawing in many ways on mindfulness for what we can call an epistemology, or a way of knowing, a looking into a way of knowing about things. That mindfulness is a wonderful lens. Actually, it's more than a lens, it's a source by which we can know, not judge, but know when we are enmeshed in a very undignified state of mind. Yeah. When we're feeling overwhelmed or angry, and these are not undignified emotions, are natural, we all have them, but rather it's, what does it lead to? Yeah, what does it lead to? We may do things we're not proud of, and so mindfulness sort of opening the door to, where am I in this sense of integrity and dignity within myself? But it's also about seeing the cause and effect, seeing the consequences. Again, not with judgment, not with self-reproach, but just seeing how patterns basically lead into suffering. Then the other thing too is that the texts are very clear on the precepts, that it's not a matter of you either break it or you don't, yeah? But rather it's more an inquiry into the intention behind what we do. and how much effort goes into it. So these two are very important for the precepts, is coming to know our intention and just sort of seeing how much effort is being put into something. So for example, if I accidentally step on a fly, let's say, which is kind of unusual because they're pretty, usually see it coming. But let's say there's a lazy fly. It's spring. So now I'm jumping ahead in my fantasy world. It's spring. You can smell the blossoms in the air. Even the flies are lazy. This could be something out of a sutra, maybe. And I don't know it, but I step on it. The act of killing that fly is fairly negligible. Yeah. My intention wasn't to do harm here. But let's say that it's not spring, it's winter. This fly is agitated because it's been inside now for 5 months and it's still snowing, right? Of course, I'm not revealing anything about myself here. But, and I go after that fly with a newspaper and just with so much anger, I just swat the heck out of it. Yeah. That's a very different thing. The intention and the effort put into it. So already we're seeing kind of a nuance here that there are gray areas around these things. And so one of those, of course, is unintentional. It has really no intention of doing harm at all. But then we get into other areas with something like non-harming, which is, does that mean then that it's really not okay to eat meat? Because I am taking part in, I may not be killing the animal, I may not be butchering it, but I am still benefiting from someone who does. And so this is another dimension in Buddhism about non-harming and non-killing. Do we benefit from someone who does break a precept? Yeah. Now, maybe the person wasn't a Buddhist, and so they have no problem. This is how their family has made a living for generations. They're beloved in the community, and they really care about the quality of the meat that they produce and so on and so forth. This is not a black and white thing. And so this is one reason why in our society and as lay people, we kind of need to really, with conscience and conscious intention, see what makes sense to us. What is it that makes sense here? So I've been accused of wearing leather. I have a leather belt. I have some shoes that have leather. And when people in the past, this hasn't happened lately, but when they say, Chris, how can you really buy into ahimsa or nonviolence when you yourself are taking part in this, in benefiting from the slaughter of certain animals? And I think that's a fair point. I could also spend all my time avoiding everything that we would consider a benefit of a slaughtered animal. There have been times in my life where I have really tried to do that. I've been a vegetarian for almost 30 years now, but I've started eating fish. Why? Because when I do, my body somehow needs something in it. I don't know what it is. I could probably get it from a plant-based source, but I'd have to go in and research it and on and on. So is that an excuse? Well, the point here is I'm not avoiding the criticism. I'm not going into denial or trying to defend a position. Yes, I have a leather belt. The point here is that we each make decisions of what we feel we really can do. And some teachers, some lineages are very clear. These precepts are not to be broken at all. And others say we need to bring in our conscience because what we're really doing is committing to awareness. So if I'm aware of where this belt came from, and I'm not just ignoring it out of avoidance, then I'm paying attention and I'm aware of it. But it's different than me going and slaughtering the animal because I want to make a profit. or in the case of intoxicants, that, I actually know someone who is in the liquor business. He actually passed away a few years ago, but he was a tycoon, a billionaire in the distribution of liquor. Yeah? And so, from a Buddhist view, that is seen to be wrong livelihood, because you're contributing to the dullness of minds and so on, as well as to addiction and all of that. So we're sort of navigating this forest of varying landscapes with these precepts. Now, what specifically does the Buddha teach about non-harming and non-killing? What constitutes a living being? And there, of course, humans and animals are all included in that. There has been some debate about plants. Are plants considered sentient? And some teachers, some thinkers say absolutely. These are sentient. They are responsive. They know that we're here. Anybody who's read Peter Wohleben's book on the secret life of trees, has anybody heard of this great volume? Yeah. Some of the things he talks about is he's a German gentleman, forestry scientist, who says, trees can actually sense our presence over time. They are aware that we are here. They have families, they have interconnectedness and through their root systems and all of that. So does that mean we don't chop down trees? I've never actually chopped one down. I certainly wouldn't blame someone if they had a good reason. So what does it mean if we think that all living beings, trees or not, have a right to live peacefully? How do we cultivate this, not just as conduct, as an ethical principle by which we live, but also cultivate it mindfully in our meditation practice? And so this is one of the things I'm always doing, is reverting it back to the cushion to cultivate, because after all, this is a place where we are engaging with our own mind more deeply. Part of the wisdom aspect of this is really getting it, learning the wisdom of how precious this human life is. It's the preciousness of being born in this human form, and how that is true for all beings. Life is so short and so precious because of it. It's the same for all, and not to be squandered. And we hear this throughout the Buddhist teachings. How do we practice it? Well, heart cultivation, mindfulness helps with attuning to that reality. Generosity, cultivating this space of generosity and loving kindness. This is one of the things that the Buddha said that enhances our sense of non-harming, our view of interdependence, or what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. The wish for all living beings to be happy. And when we say all, we're talking literally about all. We're not just sort of cherry picking who we like and who we don't, but we really mean the vow of all. And then the last thing that also has been debated among Buddhist societies and cultures that are traditionally Buddhist has to do with war and violence and military. And some countries have a very strong military, and they are kind of, the rationale there is that they defend their constituents, they defend all of the Buddhist populations. Like, for example, in Thailand has a military that is based on those roots and those rationales, that we are actually protectors of the realm of practice and temples and so on, and heritage. And we can maybe chat about this near the end of our time tonight, but my own view is that if you look at violence, war, hate, hostility, as well as maybe the need for police that have weapons, that respond to very dangerous situations. All of these things arise because of the ubiquity of the three poisons in Buddhism: greed, hatred, and delusion. Yeah? And their outcomes. So it may be that for one population, the exploitation of certain human beings yields them a great profit, such as slavery in the United States early on. It was largely an economic exploitation of black bodies for great profit for our economic system here. So we have this sense of greed here that is just at work, and that has caused profound suffering for not just African Americans, but many groups. And this isn't just true in our society; it is true across the world throughout history. And so, is it helpful to have a military that fights these wars that have been created from the three poisons? This is an open question that Buddhism poses here. So perhaps it is necessary that we do need, like, for example, a good national defense department here. And if we just rely on that without the root causes of suffering in the three poisons, then we're fighting a losing battle. Yeah. There is in Buddhism this notion of fierce compassion, which, we've been talking about it in our extension school class on compassion, and that not everything goes. Yeah. That it's not this hippie kind of thing where, hey man, it's all good, whatever you want to do is great, and then, oh, there's a bummer, there's a guy over here who's kind of talking weird and kind of a little hostile and so on. It's not that kind of spirit. We have to bring skillful means and wisdom and maintain boundaries. There is a sense in compassion, there is a sense of strength, of empowerment within truth that comes along with that strength. Part of it is, what is the narrative that flares up for us? So if we're going to call someone evil, honestly, I have kind of a hard time when we hear our public servants and newscasters using the word evil, because it's a framing. And there's no doubt, if there is such a thing as evil, Adolf Hitler was evil. Yeah? But what is evil? And how we define that matters. If we consider evil to be that which is a manifestation of profound suffering that then is turned onto a vulnerable population and exerting all of its hurt and pain onto that people to the point of genocide, that's a pretty good definition of it. And yet it's still rooted in the three poisons: deprivation, scarcity, hatred, illusion. So this is why this topic of the five precepts that often are taken to be, okay, let's practice this, let's observe it and everything. Well, when we start peeling the onion, this is more of, how is my consciousness kind of reshaped by having these conversations and seeing, where do I sit with these things? We may all sit sort of in slightly different places or very different places with it. So anyway, I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think there's a place for force through fierce compassion that does not judge the inherent the inherent worth of another being, but also can harshly judge actions, what we might call tough love. And so in that case, one of the ideas I have that I'll share with you around things like what's happening in Ukraine, any kind of global crisis where a bully, if you will, is exerting its force onto another population, there really needs to be a reaction force made up of every country on the planet that says no. And if it uses aggression, if it uses force to stop that, maybe that's where we are at this point in our evolution. But if it were made up of every country because we agree on principles, because we all want the same things, we all can live by not positions, but principles, then maybe if those principles are uncompromising, meaning we, we recognize the inherent dignity of all living beings and their right to exist peacefully, that we actually put our money where our mouth is. And if it's a global response, saying no to violence, unless we are having to be fiercely compassionate towards victims as well as towards the perpetrators. They've actually done this in India. In the past, there has been a reaction, what we could call a reaction force called the Seva Sangha, which is the service, the community of those who serve out of peace. Whenever there would be a flare-up between the Hindus and the Muslims, there was this network of communication that would go out to the members of this thing, and they would immediately go, and they had no weapons, but they would insert themselves between the factions that were violent, and it would actually work. There would be peace there. Now, I don't know what that would look like if you have 100,000 troops marching on a small country, but the point is that not to be satisfied with violence as an answer and then just sort of stopping there once the threat is gone. We have to continue to root out the causes, which is why then the three poisons matter here. Let's look at what causes greed, hatred, and delusion according to Buddhism. I don't think it's easy. First of all, I think giving up meat took me a good year before my body stopped craving it, and then another couple of years before it even saw it as food. But I had the option to do it. I had the choice to do it. There are, if you look at the Tibetan people in the Himalayas who have very, very limited access to vegetables, to leafy green vegetables, to growing things in a very harsh climate, one that is much harsher than New England. Eating meat there, they would all die if they didn't. They rely on the milk of the yak. They rely on the meat and the skin. I mean, they really do. It is part of their survival. And same is true with Inuit people and people up north. So if you don't have a choice, if it's part of what sustains you as a human being, then perhaps it's like what the indigenous peoples of our continent did, which was to really honor and revere the ones who've given up their lives so that we could live. So I think part of it is a connection, as opposed to having to split and disconnect from that meat. So I would be interested, actually, Lana, what if instead of meat or no meat, first step maybe with the family would be to really recognize and honor where the meat comes from, rather than making it a good or a bad thing, or which I know you wouldn't do, but like a sort of a morality play. Instead, it can be that which deepens the recognition of everyone in the family. And maybe even talking about how the natives, how indigenous peoples still do honor this being that has given up its life, rather than going, okay, if I buy it in a store, it's not really something I need to think about. Yeah. But if they witnessed the slaughtering, I would wager that they would become vegetarians. There are some documentaries made. I think Michael Moore did one. There are some documentaries when you really peel the layer back. Sorry to use that expression in this context, but it can really be ugly to see what is happening to animals, and it can change an entire family. So that may be something else you do, but watch some of these documentaries around food. But I don't mean to suggest that then it's an easy transition, because then it comes with a physiological change. It comes with, having to rethink nutrition and dietary needs, and so that you're not iron deficient or deficient in B12 and so on. You can get these from other sources, but it does take work, because it's not part of our ingrained culture already. We have to kind of work at it. There's also a chant in the Tibetan, Om Dili Rili Sopoha, which means if you've killed something, even a bug, or if it's a mouse or what have you, that you actually are conveying that sense of regret that this happened, and wishing them an auspicious rebirth. Yeah, because we're talking about karma, but we're also talking about rebirth. It's a way to really hold intention for that little being or big being that we've impacted in that way, whether it was through an accident or through some kind of necessity or because we are, eating meat. But it's wishing this being an auspicious rebirth, and really caring about it on their behalf. Yeah.